The UFC lightweight division has long been the benchmark of MMA weight classes, playing host to some of the sport's greatest fighters in its biggest ever bouts. But there was once a time the division was considered the promotion's black sheep. Today, we look at 155's difficult early years, a tenure marred by drug tests, departing champions, and one of the most tainted title fights of all time. Welcome to the INC, and this is the story of the UFC lightweight division's dark age. The UFC's first lightweight division wasn't technically lightweight at all. Following the introduction of the unified rules of MMA, the UFC split their roster in two, with fighters over 200 pounds competing at heavyweight and everyone else at lightweight. Frank Shamrock became the division's first champion at UFC Japan, before the belt was rechristened as the middleweight belt and later became the light heavyweight title. What modern fans know as lightweight can trace its origins back to the year 2000, when UFC matchmaker John Peretti convinced Jens Pulver and Alfonso Alcaraz to contest their welterweight bout at 155 pounds, in an attempt to convince UFC bosses that smaller fighters could be as exciting as their heavier counterparts. Peretti's insistence finally paid off, and in 2001, the UFC's new owners, Zuffa, announced the formation of a fully fledged lightweight division, with Pulver taking on Shooto champion Caol Uno for the inaugural title. While Uno entered the match as a heavy favorite, Pulver used his trademark sprawl and brawl to neutralize Uno's wrestling, the normally unflappable Japanese superstar growing frustrated as Pulver tagged him with heavy shots on the feet. A razor-close bout eventually went the way of the American, Pulver winning a unanimous decision and the new title in the process. Pulver validated his reign against Dennis Hallman at UFC 33, but the manner of the triumph won few admirers. After being rocked early in the first, Hallman remained content to work off his back for the remainder of the bout, going on to break the record for the least strikes landed in a UFC title fight, a record that stood for 16 years. While the UFC acknowledged Pulver's talent, they knew they needed a more dynamic name to spark interest in the division. The man in question was none other than BJ Penn. The 23-year-old entered the sport as one of America's most acclaimed jiu-jitsu practitioners, and by his third fight, he had developed a striking game to match his grappling prowess. The UFC were ready to strike while the iron was hot, leading to Penn receiving a title shot against Pulver in the main event of UFC 35. Penn entered the match having finished all his bouts in the first round, and looked to make quick work again by taking Pulver down early and threatening the champion with several submission attempts. Pulver, however, survived the onslaught, and by the middle of the third was forcing a tired Penn to stand and trade with him. A big strike at the end of the fifth proved critical, as Pulver claimed the judge's decision and threw a wrench into the UFC's master plan. Pulver had won over the MMA fanbase, but it was the size of that fanbase that proved most concerning. UFC 35 pulled an estimated 35,000 pay-per-view buys, and at the time of writing, this still holds the record of the worst drawing show in UFC history. And with Amanda Nunes now retired, it will likely never be beaten. The biggest shock, however, came months later, when Pulver announced he'd failed to come to terms with the UFC over a new contract, vacating his title in the process. Speaking years later, Pulver admitted the biggest reason for leaving was financial, claiming he'd only been paid $12,000 for his title match with Penn, 8 times less than fellow champions Randy Couture and Tito Ortiz. Pulver would spend the next 4 years competing in Pride Fighting Championships, a path many of his peers would follow over the coming months. Ironically, the UFC would rely on Pride to find Pulver's successor, as the company announced a 4-man tournament to crown their new champion. Caol Uno booked his place in the final with a win over Dean Thomas, while Penn secured a decision over future welterweight champion Matt Serra. Penn and Uno would lock horns at UFC 41, where bosses hoped for a show-stealing encounter to kickstart the beleaguered division. A grappling heavy bout saw a mix of takedowns and momentum shifts, with both men enjoying moments of success over 25 minutes. It was clear the judge's decision was gonna be close. Unfortunately for the UFC, it proved too close.
And Judge Steve Wright scores the bout 48-48. This UFC lightweight championship fight is considered a draw.
The inconclusive result was the final straw. While all logic pointed towards an immediate rematch, a diminishing roster added with 35's poor pay-per-view buys led the UFC to put the division on an indefinite hiatus. Uno returned to Japan shortly after, while Penn pursued his immediate career as a welterweight, claiming an upset win over longtime champion Matt Hughes. It was left to Pride to fly the lightweight flag in the coming years. Takanori Gomi, Gilbert Melendez, and Hayato Sakurai were some of the names to grace the promotion to critical and commercial acclaim, with the company's 2005 Lightweight Grand Prix regarded as one of the best events in company history. It led to the UFC experimenting with lightweight once again, during which Yves Edwards staked a claim as the division's #1 fighter, thanks to his run of 11 wins out of his past 12 fights. Edwards is considered one of the greatest fighters to never fight for a UFC title, a status further secured thanks to his highlight reel finish of Josh Thompson. The biggest factor in lightweight's revival, however, came in the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. While the season was dedicated to light heavyweights and middleweights, several of the show's alumni competed in classes well above their natural weight, and expressed interest in competing at lightweight once the show ended. One such example was Kenny Florian. The middleweight runner-up was signed to the promotion shortly after the show's finale, and quickly made up for lost time with a trio of stoppage wins. With fan interest booming and a roster of fresh talent, the UFC was ready to take another chance on 155, with Florian being booked for the revived crown against welterweight title challenger Sean Sherk. Florian had no answer to Sherk's grappling game, as the wrestler took Ken Flo down multiple times in a one-sided contest. While Florian managed to open a cut on Sherk, there was no question over which of the two men was victorious. Although renegade judge Cecil Peoples tried to make things interesting when the result was finally announced.
And Cecil Peoples, 50-48.
While the UFC again failed to crown their chosen fighter, they could take refuge in the state of the division. By 2006, lightweight featured a mix of exciting regional champions and Ultimate Fighter alum, giving the company several options to test Sherk in the coming months. Jens Pulver, however, wouldn't be one of them. The fighter returned to the UFC following his run in Pride, and his comeback at UFC 63 was given the bells and whistles worthy of a former champion. Pulver was immediately earmarked as a potential first opponent for Sherk. Company newcomer Joe Lozon put a quick stop to that.
Down goes Pulver again, but Lozon again, a left hook goes, Jens is out!
Sherk's first title defense instead came at UFC 73 against Hermes Franca, who'd returned to the promotion after a successful run in the WEC. Sherk used his wrestling to dominate Franca on the ground, neutralizing the Brazilian's submission attempts to claim a one-sided but forgettable decision. The fight's biggest impact, however, came weeks later, when both Sherk and Franca tested positive for steroids in an out-of-competition drug test, with both men receiving a 12-month suspension and Sherk being stripped of his lightweight title. Franca was embroiled in further scandals years later when he was charged with multiple battery charges, including the sexual assault of a minor. Franca served a 42-month prison sentence and was effectively blacklisted from the MMA community, making the fight with Sherk one of the darkest in MMA history. Following such a fiasco, the UFC desperately needed to restore credibility to the division, and went back to the future in order to find it. After spending the last 2 years competing in K1, BJ Penn returned to the UFC in 2006, and after 2 failed outings at 170, he decided to drop down to lightweight to face old rival Jens Pulver. A second-round submission immediately thrust Penn into the title picture, and with the most recent champion Sean Sherk being AWOL following his drug test, the decision was made for Penn to face Joe Stevenson for the vacant title at UFC 80. Stevenson entered the match with much fanfare, having won the second season of The Ultimate Fighter and 13 of his past 14 fights, but he proved to be no match for the Hawaiian. Penn dropped Stevenson in the opening seconds, hammering the Californian with ground and pound and opening a significant cut on Stevenson's hairline. It led to a foregone conclusion as Penn took Stevenson's back late in the second before finishing the match by submission. Penn becoming only the second man to win 2 titles in 2 weight classes.
It is all over! BJ Penn is the UFC lightweight champion!
Penn validated his title by defeating Shirk at UFC 84, before embarking on one of the most dominant title reigns of all time. His mix of striking and grappling making easy work of Kenny Florian and Diego Sanchez. Penn's reign helped legitimize lightweight in the eyes of fans, and by the time the Hawaiian lost the belt to Frankie Edgar, the division was seen as a thriving and worthy fixture of the UFC. The early days of the lightweight division were turbulent ones. Its first incarnation suffered from being too ahead of its time for its own good, coming when fan interest in lower weight classes was at an all-time low, and while its 2006 revival stumbled out of the gate, its rise in prominence once Penn won the belt showed the company's patience was justified. The lightweight division is proof that with the right recruitment and a strong figurehead on top, any division can see a dramatic change in its fortunes. Women's bantamweight? There's hope for you yet. This is the INC. Please like, share, and subscribe. Post your feedback in the comments and ring the bell so you never miss a video.